I'm sure that some of you have already done quite a bit of your own research, and you may know quite a bit about your families, but I like to say that you don't know what you don't know. And that's why I began doing this about, oh God, 25 years ago. And I grew up in a family where they told me that what you don't know won't hurt you. So especially if I asked my mother something and she said, well, that's not important. Just go away, go play, get out. So she'd scoop me away. And then I would go ask my father. And he would say, go ask your mother. So I'm in a loop. So anyway, quite a number of years ago, a distant cousin in Alabama sent me a small pedigree chart, and I was just so overwhelmed with it. I was terrific. I was like 18 or 19 years old. I was so impressed. I folded it up, put it in my drawer, and didn't see it again for about 20 years. But I've grown with that, and I've got a million stories that I won't necessarily bore you with today. I just want you to, take advantage of my experiences. And I like to think that I know a lot, but I certainly don't know everything. And you can ask any questions that you'd like whatsoever. And we'll get through this, and hopefully you'll all pick up a little bit. Now you'll notice that little DNA molecule spinning around on your screen. I do have maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes to at least give you the outline at the end of the presentation that we'll talk a little bit about DNA, but that I could talk about DNA for 3 solid weeks, and you would probably all fall asleep. But I just want everybody to have a little basic knowledge of what it is and how it works. So if all things being equal, let's see if we can get this started. And here we go. I like to start this with a little bit of humor, if you'd like, and you'll probably get the rhythm of this when I start to read it. And here we go. Genealogy is my pastime. I shall not stray. It maketh me to lie down and examine half-buried tombstones. It leadeth me into still courthouses. It restoreth my ancestral knowledge. It leadeth me in paths of census records and ships' passenger lists for my namesake's sake, for my surname's sake. Yea, though I walk through the shadows of research libraries and microfilm readers, I shall fear no discouragement, for a strong urge is within me. The curiosity and motivation, they comforteth me. It demandeth preparation of storage space for the acquisition of countless documents. It anointeth my head with burning midnight oil. My family group sheets runneth over. Surely birth, marriage, and death dates shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of a family history seeker forever and ever. Kind of sounds like a psalm. It really isn't, but it's kind of patterned after it, and I get a little bit of a kick out of it. So hopefully that was a good start for today's presentation. So we will do a few things. I like to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I like to tell you, and then I like to tell you what I just told you. So here we go. What we're going to cover today is I would like, whether you're amateur, professional, serious, or just, poking around, I need everybody to start with a plan. You need to sit down and decide what you want to know, how you want to know it, and start from there. But get it written down as best you can so you can follow that plan. It's like a roadmap. If you want to drive to somewhere in upstate New York, most people will get a map or use some kind of a GPS system to tell them where they're going and how to get there. And it's exactly the same thing with genealogy research. Because what happens to me, at least, is I end up going off on all these tangents, especially if I look at a newspaper and I see an ad of something that was advertised, I don't know, in 1910 or 1915. I'm intrigued, and I got to control myself. I'd like to go and investigate that too, but I'm really here investigating Uncle John. I can't go chase that ad. So start with a plan and stick to it. So I like to ask you, and a lot of people who ask me to help them out, I ask them right up front, this is, why are you looking? What are you looking for? Is it something specific? Is it something general? Is it idle curiosity? We don't know until we ask. Now, here are some common pitfalls that people fall into when they start off their research. And the very, very first one I want to bring up is family names. And what I mean by that is, and we'll get to this later about spelling, but there's also a matter of transliteration. Was your French-Canadian ancestor's name really was Fuller because your father, grandfather, great-grandfather went by Fuller? Or was his ancestor named Fournier? And when he came down to the States, he just changed it, or that's the way people pronounced it. I have a client named Boucher, and her name Americanized, it comes out in about 5 or 6 different variations. And boy, that makes it difficult, difficult to research. Is it Bonifilia or Goodson? You translate Bonifilia in Italian, at least I'm told, that means good son. Is it Perez or Peters? And in my case, is it Robeson, Robinson, Robertson, Robson? There's at least 7 or 8 different ways of spelling my own name. And this was one of my biggest roadblocks. When I was a little kid, I used to get mad when people called me Dave Robinson. And ultimately, I ended up going to a French-Canadian school in Indian Orchard. And the French-Canadian nuns would call me David Robison. So I decided that I was going to pronounce my name Robeson. That'll cure everything, and nobody will ever call me. Well, that was wrong. They still call me whatever. But at least I know now that there's all sorts of different ways to spell that name, and there's all sorts of different research challenges that presents. We want to talk about the value of vital records, and vital records are very specific. It's birth, marriage, and death. We want to talk about wills, military records, pension applications, immigration and naturalization records, diaries, Bibles, city directories, and there's more. I mean, there's lots and lots of other resources that you can use for your research. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But you have to become a bit of a detective. You have to know what type of source you're looking in. What is the information that source contains, and what type of evidence is it? Because if the source is just a handwritten note that you found in a Bible in the attic, that it's not necessarily that reliable. And even if your grandmother told you a story, my reaction, I don't say the words, but my reaction is, well, that's a great story, Grandma, but I don't believe you. I'm going to go find out what it really is. So the source is important. By source, I mean, where did you find the information? It doesn't necessarily refer to the information itself. It just refers to the source, whether it was a book you found in the library, or if it was a website you went to, or maybe your own family Bible that might be lurking about in your attic somewhere. But the source is important, and the information it contains. We could this is not terribly important to you right now, but the information that is generally categorized as primary, secondary, or simply uncertain. And primary information is information that comes from the person that had the experience or was a direct witness to the event. Secondary is like a newspaper article. The reporter wasn't there, but he got the story from someone. So there's already been one possible leap of inaccuracy. And we certainly know that there can be inaccuracies in those types of things. And evidence itself, and again, I'm just going to tell you what it is. From my perspective, it is not that important in terms of casual family research, but we refer to evidence as either primary or secondary. And in our world, primary evidence is a single document that answers the genealogical question. And then indirect evidence is when you need multiple bits of information and multiple bits of information to prove what you're trying to prove. And very often, and probably every single time this happens, there'll be conflicting evidence. And we'll talk about the reasons why that comes up. So we'll talk a bit about websites, both free and subscription. And there's plenty of those. And I like to talk about crafting an internet search. It's more of an art. It's not a science. And what I mean by that is when you open up a website and it asks you for the first name, the last name, the middle name, the date of birth, the city they were born in, when they got married, what their spouse's name was, the father, the mother, where everybody was born, when everybody was born, and they ask you a gazillion questions. I'm going to show you that it's not important to answer all those questions because, in my opinion, and I like to say that it's not a mortgage application. It's an internet search for an ancestor. And that's a very important point, and you'll understand what I mean by that a little bit later. And doing all this helps you to break down brick walls. A lot of people will tell me that they know their grandmother came in, she immigrated from wherever, but I can't find her parents, or I can't find her sister, her brother, or her cousins, or whatever. And we call that a brick wall. And there are plenty of strategies for breaking down a brick wall. This is always, well, it's kind of funny, actually. Third cousin 5 times removed. And we'll show you how they, like a superficial look at how that all is calculated. But for my own purposes, I use a family tree maker software, and the software it calculates the relationships for me. So I end up with people, because I've got family that I can document back to the Mayflower and back even farther. So I've got people in my collateral lines that are like the third cousin of the fifth cousin of the brother-in-law of the this and the that of me. And I don't have the time, nor really the inclination to go that deep into what the definition of that relationship is. But I have to tell you that I have as many people as I can find that I can attach to my tree for 2 reasons. Number one, I'm curious, and I often find people that I almost know of, but never realized that they were related to me. But I also put this out on the internet for the purposes of other people's research. Now, I might have a 5th uncle twice removed or whatever it is, and that's not necessarily important to me because he may have died in the Civil War or whatever, but someone else, that might be someone else's great-grandfather. So the information is out there. So when they find it on my tree, I have the sources listed, so they can trust what they see on that tree. And sometimes it's a breakthrough for some people. So that's why I like putting that out there. And I use a couple of different places, Ancestry links with Family Tree Maker, and they can synchronize between themselves. So that's what makes it, important to me. Making sense of all the data. What fits, what conflicts, and how to resolve it. Because I'll tell you, you will find conflicting evidence. And the short answer to that is, has to do with how public records are uploaded to the internet. So let's talk about that for a minute. First of all, only about 10 or 15% of what is completely available is accessible on the internet. 15%. There are millions upon millions of records that haven't made it to the internet yet. That's why if you're an Ancestry subscriber, or if you subscribe to any other paid research site, or if you use Family Search, which is the free site of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, every week, if you subscribe to these sites, every week you will get an email to say, we just uploaded 1 million records from Transylvania or whatever it is. And every week, 30,000 records were uploaded, 1.5 million records were uploaded. And you have to go back and search and search and search, and keep a research log so you know you've been there. If you haven't found it today, wait 6 months and go back and see if it's shown up. Now, as many records as they attempt to get up onto the internet, there are more records being produced. So it's like that Lucille Ball thing when she worked in the candy factory. There's no matter how fast she pulled that stuff off the conveyor belt, there was more coming at her. And that happened to be a really hysterical scene, but maybe some of you had seen it, maybe not. But anyway, and the process is this. Some organization, and I use Family Search as an example, they go to an archive and they digitize the records, which means they just take a fancy schmancy picture of the record. Then they take it back and they will upload it. But then somebody has to take the information that we want to see in a blank form and look at the original records and try to figure out what it says and put all the right words into the right blocks. And that's called indexing. Once it is indexed, then you can go on the internet and look for that person with names or dates of birth or whatever. The problem with indexing is handwriting and spelling. So a 3 can very often look like an 8 or a 5. So when you think your ancestor was, you might have three records on an ancestor. One says they were born in 1783, one says 1788, the other says 1785. Who's right? Well, you got to gather more and more evidence. If it's really critical to get that exact date, year of birth, you need to find more evidence to resolve the conflict. And we have conflicts of information all the time. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about DNA. I'm not going to bore you to tears or put you to sleep, but just a quick overview, of DNA so that you'll know what it's all about. Lots of people have questions about DNA and what it's for and how to use it. So we all have ancestors. So if you're out there looking for your ancestors, my question is, do you know how many ancestors you can possibly find? And this chart gets a little bit crazy towards the end, but we know there's you. I mean, that's obvious. Everyone has two biological parents. You can't escape that fact. Everyone has two biological parents. You got to have a mother, you got to have a father. That's really easy. The parents also each have two parents. So your grandparents, there are four. So you have two parents. Your mother has two parents who are your grandparents. Your father has two parents who are your grandparents. So the second generation here, there are four. And then it continues to double. You have 8 great-grandparents, 16 second great-grandparents, and I have all these folks in my tree. I know who they all are. Third great-grandparents, there are 32 individual people who are your third level great-grandparents. I have 30 of my great-grandparents. There's 2 that I just haven't been able to find. So obviously on the 4th level, it's 64. And on the 5th level, it's 128 individuals are your 5th great-grandparents. It's biology. It's not somebody's conjecture or somebody said, well, it should be this. It's absolutely biology. I know probably a little more than half of my 5th great-grandparents. And the interesting thing is, I belong to the Sons of the American Revolution and the Mayflower and all that. But if I didn't have this information here, I would be nowhere. I have 4th and 5th generation ancestors who fought in the Revolutionary War. I have some 4ths that fought in the War of 1812, and I've got people in the Civil War. I mean, it just goes up the line. So that really was my motivation for doing all this stuff, because I didn't know who the heck I was. My father came up from the South, married my mother, and that was the end of it. I never met my paternal grandfather, and I could go on and on and on about the stuff that they didn't tell me. But I found out. Okay, 5th great-grandparents, obviously, 256. 7th, 512, and then it just starts to get ridiculous. 10th, 11th, 12th, and it keeps going on and on and on. Now, this is not a cumulative number. This is the actual number of this generation. Now, my Mayflower ancestors are in the 9th, 10th, and 11th generation. I've got about a half a dozen of them. So I've been around for an awful long time here in Massachusetts. And I'm lucky on my father's side because they were not recent immigrants. The original paternal grandfather came over from Ulster County, Ireland in 1740. So the Robeson, Robertson, Robinson name has been here for, quite a while as well. Not quite as much as the Mayflowers, of course, but the total here, if you add up all these numbers, there's 524,287 individuals that, if you're never going to find them all. It's just that simple. But that's the task that you're confronting yourself with, 524,000. And that doesn't include the siblings. That doesn't include brothers and sisters. So there's more than 500,000 people just to get you here today, and that's not counting the rest of the kids. So we'll talk about, why are you looking? Is it just simple curiosity? I mean, that might be the motivation for a lot of folks. They want to know if that guy was really their grandfather, that guy was really their great-granduncle, or whatever. You want to prove or disprove family stories and myths. You have this story that one of your ancestors was in the James Gang, or one of your ancestors invented this, or one of your ancestors did that. And then those are family stories that are treasures. And I'm not trying to say that none of them are true. Many of them are true, but I will say that many of them are also embellished as they come down through the generations. So it's good to be able to prove or disprove family stories and maybe family myths. The next might be buried treasure. I got to tell you about Phyllis Chandler. Now, a very good friend of mine called me up one day and he said, I want you to talk to an attorney in Mattapan. Okay. He said, what about? He says, well, I told him we were related and he wants to ask you some questions. Now, the backstory here is that I had done a lot of family research for this guy and for his, so I knew a lot about his family. Anyway, so I said, aren't you going to tell me what this guy wants? He said, no, you just call him and get him on the phone and he knows why you're calling and he'll ask you the questions. I said, okay, fine. So I called up the attorney and I went through this thing. He says, do you have a record on this particular individual, which is my buddy's great-grandfather? Sure. I said, here he is. When was he born? I told him. Where was he born? I told him. What was his wife's name? I told him. And then he gave me a trick question because this was a family that got together in the 1920s, I would say. I don't remember off the top of my head. But anyway, they said, how many children did they have? Because most families had, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, whatever children. So it's a bit of a trick question because this particular guy only had one daughter, and that was Phyllis. Phyllis married a guy named Chandler, and the attorney was calling me because Mr. Chandler had died several years ago. And he says, I'm sorry to tell you this now, but your cousin Phyllis died last week. Well, I had to react, so I said, oh my God, really? Oh, it's because I'm supposed to be related to her. So, but the point of the story is this: Phyllis left an estate worth $170,000 in cash and lots of other real property that my friend and his siblings could claim and share. It was the obligation of the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to do due diligence in finding relatives of Phyllis Chandler because there was nobody else around. So that's a good story. How about famous relatives, long lost family? Oh, famous relatives, there we go. And in my searching, I am tangentially related to President Taft and Harry Chapin and then this an actor named Marion Morrison. And of course, everybody knows who Marion Morrison is. And if you don't, his stage name was John Wayne. And I got all of these people, and what does that get me? I mean, I just have the knowledge that I'm related to them, but what does it really get me? It just gets me a good story, I suppose. How about shifty relatives? We all have some shifty relatives, I think, don't we? Somebody that you really didn't know what they were really about. Maybe he was this, maybe he was that, a counterfeiter or bank robber, whatever. You might have some shifty relatives, and I'll tell you that the easiest ancestor to research is a criminal, because their information is everywhere. They're in the newspaper, they're in the courthouses, they're in the obituary. I mean, they're everywhere. There's all kinds of information. You can't hide if you're a criminal and you've been arrested. There's just no way you can hide. Well, you can leave town, I suppose, but you're going to leave a trail that a good genealogist can track down and get answers to some of your questions. And how about this one? Did Great Uncle Harry really have 3 wives? Now, having 3 wives is not a big deal. Plenty of people have 3 wives. Plenty of people have 3 husbands. But did he have 3 wives all at the same time? And that's the question that you might want to find out, or maybe you'll find it out when you do your research. You didn't know that at the beginning. And that's a thing that we did at Boston University in one of the genealogy programs I took. We had to prove that a particular guy was the same guy who left his wife and children in one location, traveled 500 or 600 miles and married some other woman. And then he left her and he traveled about 1,000 miles and he settled down with the 3rd wife, never having divorced the first 2. And that's where he lived out the rest of his life and died. And it was a little tricky figuring it out, but we got all the answers. We got all the answers we needed. Kind of a cad, this guy. He was a kind of a creepy guy. But anyway, it was a good exercise in genealogy research. Now, on a serious note, the causes of death, many people would like to know the causes of death of their ancestors and perhaps their medical histories. And some people avidly research this aspect, and some people just simply put their hands up and say, I don't want to know. And I understand both ends of that. I mean, if you're motivated to find this information, great, we'll try and find it for you. But if you're not, that's fine. And if we find it, we probably wouldn't divulge it to you because you don't want to know. So this is a very good and interesting aspect of genealogy research. Speaking of that, did anybody see that program last night with CeCe Moore? It was very interesting, and I understand why the police had such a difficult time, and I also understand why it only took CeCe 2 or 3 hours to answer the question that who the murderer was, and it was a powerful program. It's a powerful program, and she's done a lot of fantastic work in that area of genetic genealogy. And perhaps you want to write your family story, and I encourage you to write your family story. And what I call that is just leaving a legacy for your descendants. Now, your kids might not be too terribly interested, but maybe your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren that you probably will never get a chance to meet, or great-great-grandchildren. And I usually ask a class when we're live, I ask, who wants to talk to their great-grandparents? And almost every arm goes up. Oh, yeah, I'd love to be able to talk to her, but she died when I was 3 or 6 or whatever. Well, I want you to talk to your descendants. Write your story, write your family story. And I've got questions that you can ask yourself, or you can be interviewed by someone else, but recorded audio on an audio file, recorded with a camcorder, or that's what they don't call them camcorders anymore, do they, Lindsay? What do they call them? Anyway, or just handwrite it out and just hand something off to your descendants. I have a client who is highly motivated for this. And we've been working for almost 2 years to put everything together. We've got a little over 2,500 of his and his wife's ancestors, and of course his descendants. He has children, grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. So he wants to turn it into a book. And I said to him, well, how many copies of this book do you need? So he went, let's see, I need one for this. Him and Hod. He says, I need 31 copies of the book. Okay, we'll see. We'll see what we can do about that. So there's 700 pages to his story that we put together, and that's another story how I got that done. But at any rate, what's next? Making your plan. All right. What do you already know? Your parents, your grandparents, where they were born, when they were born, when they were married, and on through the generations. Who your cousins are, who your siblings of your let's see, your aunt and your uncle, and just how far out can you expand your family tree? What do you already know? Because a lot of those facts you may find out are not really accurate, but you'll have a chance to set the record straight pretty much. How do you know it? Who told you? Was it in a handwritten letter? Was it verbally given to you over the years? How do you know it? What do you want to know? Maybe you only want to get back to your great-grandparents. Maybe you want to find out what country your ancestors emigrated out of. So there's a lot of different things that you would like to know. And where can you find that information? That's the trick. Where can you find it? And there are literally hundreds of websites. Most of them are paid, but there's hundreds of websites that you can access. And of course, there's libraries and there's archives and there's historical societies and genealogical societies. And so there's plenty of offline resources that can help you. So you need to begin listing what you have and what's missing. You might have the birth and death certificate on an ancestor, but you don't have the marriage certificate or something else. There's always something missing, always something that you have to chase down. So you've got to go out and search for the existing information. It's out there somewhere. And I know that I have Irish clients that very often say, well, you can't do my research. Everything burned in 1922. Well, that's not true. Well, a lot did, but they're recreating all of that stuff from parish records and municipal records. And there's all sorts of sources and places that they can go to recreate the information that was burned in 1922. So that's not a lost cause. You need to make a research plan, as we talked about in one of the first slides. You know, what do you know? What you know, and what do you want to find out, and how are you going to go about finding it? Oftentimes, this involves a trip to an archive somewhere. For example, the Museum of Springfield History and Archives, the Massachusetts State Archives in Boston, or any of the other archives that exist around the country. Much of that information that exists there are documents that are digitized and uploaded, but not all of it. So you may end up having to at least make contact with one of those operations. So next, we keep track of your sources, because you won't remember. Where did I find this? Because I need to get some more information. I have no idea where I found this. Whether it was a website or whether you physically went somewhere and made a copy of a document or a set of documents, but you need to record where that information came from. And once you know where it came from, you need to write it down. Writing it down is, when I print something, for example, off of one of the internet sites, I always print the source citation, so I know where I got that document, not only where I got it, but when I got it. And it helps me a great deal, because sometimes a client will come back after 5 or 6 years and say, okay, now I want to do this, or I don't want to do that. And if I have a lot of the basic information already done, it helps that part of the job. So let's talk about a pedigree chart. We all know what the pedigree chart is, hopefully. These are all available on the internet, so there isn't any reason to make copies of this or to write down what it says, but I'll tell you how it's structured. It's kind of simple. You put yourself on this line, your name, where you were born, when you were born, where you were born, and if you are married, the date of your marriage, and your spouse would go down here. Now up here would be, this line goes up here to your father. So the father goes up here and the mother goes here. And the same thing with your father. He has a father and a mother. And your grandfather has a father and a mother. And these things can continue on and on and on and on and on. But the only thing the pedigree chart doesn't do is it doesn't list siblings. So you might not know who the siblings are. There are also numbering systems. So you would always be number 1. Your father would always be number 2. Your mother number 3. So your father's number 3, but his father, number 2 rather, but his father is number 4 because his wife is number 3. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And if you notice, or well, I'll just tell you that all the males from after you, the males have an even number in this chart. The females would have an odd number. Now, this was terrific 10 or 15 years ago. We all filled these out by hand. We all wrote information. We all coded them and linked one chart to the next, to the next, to the next. But with software today, whether you buy a nice fancy schmancy bit of software or just some simple software, and there are free sites where you can do this. You can just type in the names and type in the information, and it makes it so much easier to keep track of that business. Here's where the fun begins with relationships. Now, this is a slightly different style of relationship grid, and I don't know how well you can see great aunt or uncle up here, or third cousin twice removed, but I'm going to hide all of that for a minute and just talk about these 3 people here. So you know who you are. You've got yourself and your siblings. If you have them, you know who they are, and you know where your first cousins came from. And certainly, where did you know your first cousins, what your cousin came from? Because your first cousin and you are descended from the same grandparents. Or, of course, it can get complicated if the grandfather was married twice and this cousin is descended from the second one, and all of that other stuff. But basically, a first cousin is a descendant of this generation. Your parent has a sibling who would be your aunt and uncle, and their children become your first cousins. And then as the chart moves on, there we go. Your second cousin, and I'm sure you've heard this term, a second cousin. Your second cousin is the descendant from the great-grandparent generation. Your third cousin is descended from the second great-grandparent generation. fourth descended from the third, and fifth descended from the fourth. So it's kind of easy if you have this generation here, fourth cousin, subtract one, and its third cousin is the common ancestor. And this is how C.C. Moore found this guy. She found cousins, and she found all kinds of relatives. She discovered marriages and remarriages, and she plotted it all out, and she was able to figure out incredibly accurately who the perpetrator was, and they got him. But anyway, but what about this second cousin twice removed? What the heck does that mean? The second cousin twice removed, you take the second and the 2 for twice, add it together is 4, subtract 1, it's third great grandparent. And that's how that works. But it gets a little bit strange down here on the next one here. Let's go, there we go. Of course, you know who yourself, you know your child, you'll know your grandchildren, and you may not know your greats or your second greats, third greats, fourth greats, etc. Your siblings' children, of course, is your niece or nephew, your grandniece or nephew, great-grandnephew. But your first cousin's descendants are all still technically your first cousins, but this person would be your first cousin once removed, first cousin twice removed, first cousin thrice removed, and 4 times removed. And if you take the first cousin 4 times removed, if they're all descended from that first cousin. So that 1 plus 4 minus 1 doesn't work because they're all descended from the same grandparent. So if you, and this chart isn't complete, this is just a brief graphic. So over here, your third cousin, I don't know that you know any of your third cousins necessarily, but their children are your third cousins once removed. Their grandchildren are your third cousins twice removed. And again, this is some calculation that I don't bother trying to figure out on my own because I know I'll be wrong. So I use my software to do all these calculations for me. And a couple of these things, well, I'll tell you later on where you can get some of these, some of this information. It's at my website. I have a free download of tons and tons of different documents, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So what's next? Common pitfalls. What could we possibly have done that caused us to have a roadblock or a brick wall? First of all, it's assuming that it's all on the internet. Well, I can't find it on the internet, so obviously the document doesn't exist. Well, that's not true. But if you assume it's that it's all on the internet, you're going to miss 70, 80, 90% of the stuff that you really could find with enough diligence. The second principle for me is if it's on the internet, it's true. And I know that this is a fact because who said it? Abraham Lincoln. Now, if Abraham Lincoln said if it's on the internet, it's true, you got to believe him. I mean, this guy was as honest as the day is long, right? I can't hear you laughing, but I'm sure you're all rolling on the floor with that one, but at any rate. So that's something that's common. I call it a common pitfall. So believing family stories. Now, I'm not trying to say to you that what your grandfather told you is a bunch of hokey. I'm not trying to tell you that what your cousin told you is nonsense. I'm not trying to say that to you at all. What I'm saying to you is that there might be an element of truth. There might be a whole lot of truth, and it might be perfectly true. But I'd still check it. That's me. I'm a doubting Thomas, if you can believe it. Or I'm from Missouri, if you got to show me. So I listen to the family stories. I'm grateful. I thank them. I smile. Then when I get back to my office, I research to make sure that what the information I was given is accurate. Copying non-sourced data. This is kind of a broad subject. If you go to Ancestry.com, for example, and look at a family tree, the odds are that family tree does not have any sources whatsoever to prove that the information is correct. It might be correct, but if it's not sourced, you cannot trust it. So rarely do I go to an online resource to get genealogical information. If I'm desperate because I can't find it anywhere else, I might go and try and find a tree that does have sources, but those trees are few and far between. Or the source will be a letter from my uncle or a diary that I found, and all sorts of other things that are really not terribly reliable. So if you're copying down, I'll tell you, give an example. I've got, I don't know, close to 50,000 people on my tree at Ancestry. 99.9% of it is sourced. It's all documented. But I could put up there that Mickey Mouse was my great-grandfather, and I absolutely guarantee you that somebody would copy that and put it in their tree. Of course, I don't have any way to prove it because he's a fictional character, but that's an extreme example of what I'm talking about. They heard that so-and-so was their great uncle, so they stick that into their tree. That's not good. Family search, although their enormous resource is incredibly reliable, their family trees are anything but. What they do, what that website does, is it takes, anybody can upload a tree and anybody can edit a tree. So if and this is a true story, that friend of mine I was telling you about that had the cousin that we don't know died, I found his brother, his oldest brother, I found on that tree. And the brother, he allegedly died in 1987. And that's right on the tree for everybody to copy. And I'm sure that hundreds of people have copied it. But his brother was alive and has been alive all that time. I had a fourth great grandmother who had children 10 or 12 years after she died. That didn't happen. But that information is sitting out there, and there's people that will just take it at face value and pull it over. So be careful for that. And relying on one source, we talked about that kind of already. Failing to record where you've been, and again, we talked about that. Failing to record your sources. And finally, I can't say this enough times, spelling doesn't count. Untold numbers of people have said, well, yeah, that's it, but they didn't spell it that way. So I just smile and shake my head, and I just continue on with what I was doing. For a whole bunch of reasons. Like down south in Alabama, they called me Dave Robinson. My grandfather called himself Cecil Robinson. So how do you spell that? Because what you heard isn't necessarily what ended up on paper, because spelling was not that important. As long as you got the general gist of what was being said, it ended up on a piece of paper, and that's what they said. My fourth great grandmother couldn't get her War of 1812 veterans pension because her husband had spelled his name 4 different ways in his military record, and that was a nightmare. It took her 20 years, but she did get it. She did get it. So what's next? Names. Transliterated names. Why do people transliterate their names? Meaning change it from their original name into an English form of their original name. Why did they do it? They do it so that they could get a job in this country, so they could make friends in this country, so the guy at the bank can spell their name correctly. They did it for a whole lot of reasons. And I also want to make a quick, well, here, let me keep kind of going here because I think it comes up here in a minute. Cultural naming conventions can be they can help you and they can hurt you. The traditional Swedish naming convention. Does anybody know who Eric the Red was? The Viking? You've all heard of Eric the Red. And his son's name was Leif Erikson. That's a real thing. The sons were named with the father's name, first name, with the word son on the end. And the daughters were named after the mother with the mother's first name and their word for daughter, which I don't want to pronounce and embarrass myself. But anyway, and there's other naming conventions that you have to be aware of. A necronym, and many folks name their children after people who have died to honor those people or for whatever other reason they might find. And I'll also mention this at this point. You may be researching a family that was on a census record in the 1860 census or 70 or 80, and you might find that they had, or your research has told you that they had 4 sons named John, but the census record only shows you 1. So why would a family have 4 sons named John? The simplistic answer is this. The first one was born and they named him John because they wanted to have a son named John for whatever reason. But John didn't survive. He only was 3 months old when he died. So the next boy that was born, they named him John. That was 2 years later or 1 year later or whatever. but that son didn't survive. So they named the third one John, and that one didn't survive. And it wasn't until the fourth son was named John, and that fourth John lived to adulthood and had his own family. And that's why you find one family. What's going on with this? One son was born this year, the other son that year. That might be the answer, but it's an easy, simplistic way of explaining how that happens. So go on to the next page here. I'm sure there's some French Canadians in the audience here, you may or may not have run into dit names, and dit or D is the French word for say, and you'll find French Canadian names that are like Boulanger, Dit, Bouchard, or something like that. And there's a long explanation as to why that is. But the first name in that series is the family name. The second name in that series is a name that they took perhaps from the landlord of the property that they lived on, or for a military hero, or for a great-grandfather, whatever the reason is. But dit names were very popular in French Canada because it was a norm in feudal France. But the people in feudal France dropped that after the French Revolution. They stopped using that system, but they didn't know that in Canada. So they continued to use it. Right up until the late 19th century and early 20th, you'll find French Canadians with those dit names, and it really is a trick to get it figured out. All right. How about Ellis Island? Everybody's going to tell me that they had ancestors on Ellis Island that had their name changed. And I'm here to tell you it didn't happen. I'll let you digest that for a second. The ship's manifests that were required beginning in 1820 were written in the port of departure. So whatever the passenger said his name was, is the name that got written on the ship's manifest. Now, the passenger may have been illiterate, or he didn't pronounce his name quite right, or the clerk heard it differently and wrote it down differently. But once they got to Ellis Island or any other port of entry in the United States, all around the country, from Washington State all the way up to Maine, those ships' manifests were written in the port of departure. And if you see a ship's manifest, 9 times out of 10, you'll just see a check mark in the left column. That person, that person, that person. In most of these places, particularly Ellis Island, they had people that spoke nearly every language on the planet. So that was not an issue. If they changed their name after they got here, sure. If you had somebody that had 37 letters in their name, they wanted to shorten it, again, to make it easier to pronounce so they could get a job, find a place to live, et cetera, et cetera. So let's move on. And I'm willing to take the challenge on that issue. Again, spelling doesn't count. We talked about that. Records. I'm going to speed up a little bit. Well, I don't even know what time it is. Vital records I mentioned were birth, marriage, and death. Census records, yes, you have a population census other than 1890, which was lost in a, it didn't burn, but the building was burning, and the fire department put it out with their hoses. But the 1890 census was stored in the basement, and it got drenched. It was saturated, and all they did was shovel all the paperwork outside. They never recovered any of it. That's why the 1890 census isn't around. But in addition to population censuses, you have agricultural censuses, and you have manufacturing censuses. And for a short period of time, there were death census records. They would go around and to find out causes of death of everyone that died in the previous 12 months. They don't do that. They haven't done that since the late 1800s. So you may find a death, you may not. Immigration, passport applications, ships manifests, those are great sources of family information. And naturalization. There's 3 steps to the naturalization process. First of all, you petitioned your desire to apply for naturalization. Then you had to wait sometimes 3 years, sometimes 5 years. Then you declared that you wanted to be a United States citizen. And both of those actions produced documents that are somewhere, either with the federal government's, whatever, I can't remember the name of the agency because they flipped it around and changed the name. But these numbers, the numbers of these applications will very often be found on an immigration, a ship's manifest. you'll see a ship's manifest, and above somebody's name or somewhere on that line, it'll be a number with a dash in it, and it's a code for the application number of the person petitioning for naturalization. They had to prove that the person came into the country legally. And then finally was the actual naturalization. When that event happened, there's a document for that as well. City directories are overlooked 99% of the time. They're powerful sources of information. Probate and land records, public information. No one can tell you you can't see it. In Hampden County, you go to the courthouse and you go through a card file, you find your person, you write down the file number and the page numbers and so forth, and give it to the clerk, and she'll bring it right out for you. Vertical files are unindexed pieces of paper that don't necessarily belong here or there, but they're valuable pieces of paper, and they're vertical files found in many libraries and many archives that may contain information about your family. Published genealogies, and I mentioned Google Books here, I mentioned WorldCat, which is worldcat.org, and I mentioned the Library of Congress, LOC.org. All of these three places are treasures for finding books. Google Books is amazing. Just about any person in my family, I can go to Google Books and I just type in the surname, and more often than not, there's somebody somewhere along the line published a book about that family. And so that's kind of a treasure. There are many unpublished genealogies that are just sitting on the shelves in libraries and repositories. Voters lists can be a blessing to you. And church, cemetery, and funeral home records can also help you with your research. I'm going to keep going here kind of quick. Vital records, birth, marriage, and death. I just want to show you this. This was a format that you will see up until about 1906. So I transcribed what these columns mean. You'll get the number of the record, the date of the birth, name and surname of the child, and up to this time, they would indicate the color if other than white. They would indicate the sex and condition, and the condition meaning twin, illegitimate, triplets, stillborn, those kinds of answers. The place of birth, name and residence of the family, occupation of the father, and then place of birth of father and mother. So this is again, a huge bonus if you can find and they're not that difficult to find, so I shouldn't say it that way. When you find the birth indexes or any birth record, they have a wealth of information for you. Ancestry has many of these, Family Search has many of these, and American Ancestors has an enormous collection. American Ancestors is the website of the New England Historic Genealogical Society. It's a subscription site, but if you're intense on your research, it's worth the expense. This is a marriage register. So you see there's two names and a space, two names and a space. That's groom, bride, groom, bride, groom, bride, all the way down the line. And what you'll get is the date of the marriage, the name of the groom and the bride, residences at their time of marriage, their ages, their occupations, places of birth, names of the parents. What marriage is it? I have found a fifth marriage. I have found somebody that on one of these registers that was marrying for the fifth time. I shudder to think what happened to 1 through 4, and date of the record. And then finally, the death records. These death indexes are sobering at best. If you could see this very well, which I'm sure you can't, and you look down the ages of these folks that died, 28% on this page are children less than 2 years old. It's heartbreaking. This is in 1895. We could, today's medicine would probably have saved 99% of those poor kids that there was no way to help them to survive. And there's one other story here, but we are getting close on time. I don't know when I'm going to get kicked out here, but here we go. You'll find the number of the record, the date of the death, the date of the record, name and surname, sex, condition, and usually you should find the age in years, months, and days, the disease or cause of death, either the residence where the person lived, the place of death, and the place of burial. For example, there's no hospital in Long Meadow, but if you're taking your last breaths and you get rushed off to the hospital and it's Bay State, then your residence was Long Meadow, your place of death would be Springfield, but then you might get buried in, I don't know, Palmer, for, you know, just to throw a town out there. So there could be 3 different locations here. What your occupation was, what your place of birth is, and your parents' name. Here's the problem. Very often, people that are you know, they're living on their own, and they're gone, and the neighbor finds them, which is a sad thing. It happens. And then who's going to give the information? They don't know who the son is, the grandson, the cousins. They don't know anybody in the family. So they do their best to pull this information together. And if that's the case, you're not going to get most of this, or you'll get people that guess at the information, which is kind of dangerous. Let's look at, and I know you might have questions on this, but, you know, please put your question in the chat. And you know how to do that, I hope. There's a little button down at the bottom of your screen for chat. I forget what color it is, but you can just type it in there, and Lindsay will get that for you. This is a 1930 census, and I use this because I want to show you this part of that census. And I'll tell you what's in there. This is details drawn from that 1930 census, and it's drawn from, just from that little section that's in the red. There's a barrel of information here. First of all, these are the individuals that were at 34 Tyler Street. First of all, there's a guy named Clement A. Dixon, who was the head of household. He owned the residence. They asked him if you owned it or rented it. And since he owned it, he gave the value as $6,000. If they rented, they would tell you what the monthly rent was. He was a white male, aged 41. And they asked if you had a radio in 1930. And there was a radio in the home. The family did not live on a farm. And this is not an idle question. They're looking for the agricultural capacities of the country. And if you didn't live on the farm and you lived in the city, you probably worked in some industry. And that was important information. He was 35 at the time of his first marriage. And this goes on. Let's see, what else do we have on this guy? He was not attending school. Both of his parents were born in Canada. He and both of his parents were born in Canada. And you'll see Canada English, because that's not Quebec or any of the French provinces. He immigrated to the United States in 1915 and had filed his intention to naturalize. So if you're looking at a 1930 census, that column of someone that wasn't born in the United States, it'll have one of 3 codes, either AL for alien, NA for naturalized, or it could have PA, which means they had filed their papers, or they had begun their process to naturalize. So that's what that mystery is. The PA doesn't stand for Pennsylvania, it stands for papers. In this case, he could speak English. His trade was furnace installer. He was a heating contractor. And now we move into the next line will give us the rest of the family here. Again, 34 Tyler Street. The rest of the family, Hazel A. She was the wife of the head of household. She was a white female, 34, married at age 28. He was 35, don't forget. Born in Massachusetts, parents born in Massachusetts. Who's next? She spoke English, and her occupation was none, which isn't surprising, because it was the Depression. So you were lucky if you had a job to do. She did work beforehand based on other information, but in 1930 she had no occupation. So the rest of them, you have Beatrice, who was a daughter to the head of household. At this time, she was a white female, age 5, and single, of course. She was not attending school yet. She was born in Massachusetts, but her father was born in Canada. Her mother was born in Massachusetts. Next on the list is Clement, a son to the head of household, and pretty much the same information you got on Beatrice. He was born in Massachusetts, father born in Canada, mother born in Massachusetts. The next one, in this particular research project, this was a bit of a coup, because I knew that the mother was Canadian. This Clement was born in Canada, but I couldn't get much information on this person. And this is his mother. Why she was at 34 Tyler Street in 1930, I can't tell you, but she was living with them in 1932 or 1930, and she was the mother to the head of household, white female, age 76. She was a widow. So now I know that her husband died before 1930, so that kind of helps the research. Not attending school. She could read and write English. She and her mother were born in Canada, but her father was born in Ireland, and she had no occupation. But I will tell you, when I found her death certificate, she did have an occupation. She was listed as a gentlewoman. How do you like that? You never hear that anymore. Anyway, and then this is a guy that was just a boarder, Charles Wyatt. He was a boarder, age 41, and blah, 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 has all the details on Charlie Wyatt. There was a lot of people that were in other people's households in this time, and even up to today. They're either just a boarder or they're a household helper. It might be the maid, it might be a servant, it might be a farmhand, it might be any one of a number of things. But if they're not blood related to the head of household, they would indicate something. This is a quick look at a ship's passenger list, and I know it's a horrible thing to take a look at, but if you can scroll across here, you see the check marks in the far left column. That's when these people passed through the clerk and declared who they were, showed their paperwork, and so the clerk just checked them off. This is the last name, first name. And then it gives you information. Oh, this, by the way, this type of information began being collected starting in 1880. The 1820 to 1879 is a bit of a nightmare. But the sex, age, marital condition, occupation, and what language did the person speak, and what was their home address? In other words, where are they coming from? Which is very good information to find if you're trying to research ancestors that came over from Europe. They also asked them how much money they had with them. They asked them if they'd ever been in the country before. And over here, they asked them a lot of questions about their health. Could they read or write, and a few other things. But down here in the middle, this is the person's declaring where they were going once they got into the port of entry. This is incredibly valuable because this guy right here might be headed to go live with this guy who might be his father, it might be his uncle, it might be his cousin, but that's a lead, what you're getting here. You're a detective, and this is a lead for you to help find the rest of the family. So these are great to find if you can search for them and if you can find them. And this is just an example of immigration paperwork. This is a petition to naturalize. And you can see there's lots and lots and lots and lots of information that can be put in here. This particular person doesn't have a whole lot of things to say because he wasn't married and he didn't have a lot of, well, he was married, but he didn't have a lot of kids. So he put in the petition, and then he put in the declaration, and then this is the backside, which I've hidden. I don't know why, but this is that's his signature, and this is the naturalization document itself. All right. Let's go on here, city directories. And I need to point this out because they're sort of, in a way, they're a bit like census records, but they were published every year, whereas a census is only every 10 years. The city directories are published every year. And if I highlight this one, little area, you'll notice that the Cavalier Restaurant, which this is 1967, I think, the Cavalier Restaurant, which is still open, by the way. The reason it's all in bold is because he paid for this. This is sort of an ad. So he paid extra money to have all of this stuff on here, catering to weddings, banquets, and private parties. It's an advertisement for his business. And that made a whole lot of sense because many people referred to city directories in those days. And below that, you see the Kavanaughs, and they may all be related, but I'm not sure because many of them live at 8 Highland Avenue. You have Dorothy, you have Evelyn, you have Lucinda, you have Rhoda, and you also have their occupations, and you have other things that are in code. Now, Lucinda, she might be the mother of all these folks because right here it says Lucinda is a widow, and she's the widow of Frank. So that's a clue that Frank well, he certainly is gone by 1967, but it kind of helps you narrow down the search if you're looking for the death record for Frank. Down here, William, they put his wife's name in parentheses. So William, and his wife is Irene. He is a pressman. We can't remember what AGS stands for, but he lived on Stewart Street in Aldenville in Chicopee. So these are gold mines of information if you're trying to find detail on your ancestors, and the libraries have these for the most part. Probate and wills, I'll just do this very quickly. This is a typical example of a 17th, 18th, or 19th century will. I know you can't read it, and I could barely read it, but the language in these things are pretty much boilerplate. Most of the things that they wrote, and then later in the 18th century, they printed them with all the boilerplate stuff pre-printed, and then you just had to fill in the blanks. But I transcribed this. Now, a transcription is copying what is written originally, warts and all. So if you see this, I wrote, it says, "In the name of God, amen, I, William White Sr." Now, the reason I put a superscripted R there is because that's the way it's written on the document. And if there's anything in here that is misspelled, I have to misspell it the same way they misspelled it in the original. And this is underscored in the original, so I had to underscore it here. William is written as W superscripted M. You do not translate these transitions. Now, you might say, well, that's senior. Well, yeah, it is. But you don't write out senior if you're doing a transcription. You write it exactly as you see it. And all the rest of the information that you see here is a transcription. And if you look at this, no wonder there's difficulties with spelling and difficulties with accurate information, because this had to get transcribed for me to find it, and it had to get transcribed, and it had to get indexed, and then it went up on the internet. And that now you can find this fairly easy. Now, I'll look to you for a second here. How much time do we have? Because I'm just going to keep going.
We are okay. We shouldn't have a limit.
Okay, we shouldn't have a limit. Okay, so these are 4 websites that are excellent for research. And again, this is at my website under a tab called what do I call it? Free documents or something like that. But I'll explain that to you in a minute. And if we have a chance, I'm going to go to some of these sites and show you how they work. And I especially want to go to Ancestry. Again, useful online sources, libraries, local family history centers. That's the family history centers, the church, the Mormon church. NARA is the National Archives and Records Administration. The W.E.B. Du Bois Library at UMass, that's the tallest building at UMass, 27 or 28 stories. City and town clerks, land courts, probate courts. Churches usually have enormous amounts of information. Sometimes you get a little bit of a hard time getting the information, but persistence and politeness carries a lot of weight there. Cemeteries, funeral directors. Now, if the funeral director has to keep his records. Now, well, before they had funeral directors, pretty much it's pre-Civil War era, you're not going to find a funeral home that has these kinds of records for you, but they're bound by law to keep very accurate records indefinitely. If the funeral home has closed, they have likely transferred their files to some other funeral home. So if the funeral home is gone, just a little bit of research, a couple of phone calls will help you to find it. And if the one that doesn't have it might say, "Oh, that I didn't get that, but so and so has it," so your search is done. And I mentioned Connecticut State Library because we all live so close to Connecticut. We may have Connecticut relatives. Connecticut State Library is right across from the Capitol building, and they have a stunning collection of all sorts of records, court records, vital records, you name it, they've got it. You can find almost anything you need at the Connecticut State Library other than a parking place. Very difficult to find a parking place. So a quick primer on DNA. Of course, it's deoxyribonucleic acid, but nobody knows how to spell it, including me. So we just go by the words DNA, and DNA, it's on everybody's mind these days, or I use the term loosely. And the reason I talk about this is about chromosomes. So many of you may have heard this when you were growing up. Why can't you be like your brother? Why can't you be like your sister? Why can't you be like this one or that one or the other one? And the reason is chromosomes. And this is a map of all the chromosomes that are in the nucleus of every cell in your body other than blood. So the first 22 are pretty easy. They number them from 1 to 22 based on the size, based on the length of the chromosome, and the scientists have got this all figured out. We don't have to worry about it. So all these 22 chromosomes, one of them came from your mother, the other one came from your father, and that's where all your traits, your height, your propensity for this or that or the other thing, the color of your hair, and all sorts of other things can be determined based on how these two chromosomes bonded together. In what order did they bond? Um, and there certainly can be vast differences, even with twins. Fraternal twins don't have identical DNA. I have two nieces that are identical, grandnieces that are fraternal twins, and one is tall and relatively slender. The other is a little bit shorter and very athletic. And if you had to guess, one of them looks a little older than the other, but trust me, they were born at the same time. And then this 23rd chromosome here, I labeled it XY because this is the sex chromosome. And 23 is where that company gets their name, 23andMe. Clever name, I suppose. But the story of this chromosome, you see this representation has a fairly larger chromosome and a smaller chromosome. So if this was an XX, there would be two chromosomes about the same size, but this happens to be an XY, so it's a larger chromosome and a smaller chromosome. Everyone has either an XX chromosome here or an XY. An XX chromosome, you are a biological female. Simple as that. If you have this chromosome as an XY, you are a biological male. No more explanation beyond that. What happens in the rest of the life is another story. But this is the biology of the whole thing. Now, mothers always pass an X chromosome because they're female, so that chromosome for them is XX. So that's all they have to pass to their children is an X chromosome. The Y chromosome always comes from the male because if he's a male, he has a Y chromosome. So when it splits, when this chromosome in the dad splits, it transmits the Y chromosome. But he could also transmit his X chromosome. So if he transmits an X chromosome, this becomes an XX and the baby's a girl. If he transmits a Y, this chromosome becomes an XY and the baby will be a boy. So if you have a whole house full of daughters or a house full of sons, blame the dad. It's not mom's fault, okay? Wish they had explained that to Henry VIII, and we'd have a different history. But at any rate, in this case, oh, someone's popping in there, Lindsay. In this case, I'll show you what this is. This is called a chromosome map. And the DNA that's in the center, those 22 chromosomes are called autosomal chromosomes. Now, this is an artistic and graphic display of what these 22 chromosomes would look like. And I picked chromosome 4 right here to blow it up and to show you what this is all about. What this refers to, now the dark blue would be you. That's your chromosome, whichever it is, 1 through 22, whatever it is. The colors represent someone who matches you at those locations on the number 4 chromosome. So it looks to me like this person who was represented by orange, trust me, they're not this color in nature. It's done artistically, so to be graphic. This person has so much, and throughout here, there's so much orange. It's not a 100% match. So my guess is that this person's a mother, a father, or a sibling. The blue is also a match because there's still a fairly significant amount of blue here. And then the green, not so much. But they're all related in this case. I think I have one more. There we go. I put another person in here, the pink guy or girl or whatever it is. This just shows you, this is a very simple graphic explanation of how they match up one person's DNA to another person's DNA. And it depends on the length. And CC Moore mentioned this last night. The length is determined in centimorgans. And if you do this and you get a report on your DNA, you'll see matches of so many centimorgans on the 23rd or 21st chromosome, so many centimorgans on some other chromosome. But this is just an oversimplification. I wish I could see the looks on your faces so I would know who's not understanding this, because I may not have given you the best explanation. But suffice it to say that you are the dark blue in the background, and any of the colors here represent your DNA matches. The distance of the match determines determines the relationship, the possible relationship. Mother, father, sister, brother, great grandparents, half brothers, half cousins, have this, that, and the other thing, all the way down the line. Now here, let me see. Let me go to this next one is the bagel. This is my sesame seed bagel. All right. So in the middle here are those 23 chromosomes, 22 autosomal chromosomes and the 1 sex chromosomes. They live inside the nucleus of each of your cells. But what are these sesame seeds out here? These are linear. Chromosomes in the nucleus are linear. Chromosomes out here are a loop, and these are called mitochondria. And they live out here because they are the energy source for the cell to stay alive and to separate when the time comes, or if they're repairing, if your body's repairing a scratch or whatever, it's the mitochondrial DNA that provides the energy to do that. So I haven't talked about mitochondrial yet. So where the heck does the mitochondrial DNA come in? It always comes from the mother. It always comes from the mother. So the Y chromosome always comes from the father, and that's in here. The mitochondrial always comes from the mother. So I'll give you a really good example here. I have mitochondrial DNA because it comes from the mother. I have my mother's mitochondrial DNA. She has her mother's mitochondrial. My sister has my mother's mitochondrial DNA. My kids do not have my mother's or my mitochondrial because only a female can transmit the mitochondrial. So I'll give you a little bit more of a graphic display of what that's all about. In this graph, these red things, well, they should have been pink, but they show up as red, represent the mitochondrial DNA. Great-grandmother gave it to great-great-grandmother gave it to great, gave it to grandmother, gave it to your mother, and gave it to you. Now, or this female. Now, the red over here does not represent a much smaller piece of mitochondria. They're just trying to keep the graphic the same size. This brother has exactly the same amount of mitochondrial DNA as the sister, and they both got their mitochondria from their mother. And there's a method to my madness for explaining this in sort of in detail. The blue represents the Y chromosome, that which made this person a biological male. This person got his Y chromosome from his father, grandfather, great-great-grandfather. And this list can go on and on and on for thousands of years. Now, does this mean that you can find out if you're descended from Charlemagne or Genghis Khan or King Henry VIII or whatever? Well, if there were enough records, it could prove it. And I'll give you a story here in a minute that did prove it. But for the most part, you probably only have actual records back until maybe the 15th century or perhaps the 16th century. And it's a little tricky how you have to find out. There has to be male descendants from all of those different lines, and that's a bit of a trick. I'm not going to go into it here. But what about all these other folks? Why are they still here? Well, remember I said you got 25 or 50% of the mother's DNA and 50% of the father's? Well, we don't have that represented here. But the mother got 50% of her autosomal DNA from her grandfather and 50% from her grandmother. So does that mean that you got 25% from these four? Well, you might think so, but you didn't. It's close to 25% from your mother's side and from your father's side. And if you take that logically further, and you go back to the third or fourth or fifth generation way up here back in history, there might be a third or fourth great-grandparent line, a generation, I should say, from whom you received no DNA, autosomal DNA. You would have gotten that fourth or fifth great-grandparent's mitochondrial DNA if you're a male, or mitochondrial DNA if you're a female, or the Y DNA if you're a male. So I didn't put any numbers in here because this graph is only for the purposes of graphically showing Y DNA dissension and mitochondrial DNA dissension. We got that? Maybe some questions popping up in the chat room. We'll be happy to talk about that here in a couple minutes. What's next? Testing. Everybody who wants to get tested, they always ask me, who should I use? Which company is the best? The answer is they're all the best because it's science. And in this case, 2 + 2 is always 4. You can't, I mean, unless, and rarely, extremely rarely, there are mistakes in identifying the DNA. But for the most part, all these companies do pretty much the same thing as each other. So the results are going to be pretty much the same. The difference is going to be that company's database. Because if Ancestry.com has tested 100 million people, but 23andMe is only, or Family Tree DNA has only tested 100,000 people, you'll get more accurate information from Ancestry because they have many, 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 many more DNA tests to compare it to, as opposed to Family Tree DNA, who has a smaller sample. Now, all of these companies intersect at some point. So and myself, I've done this. I've tested with every company so that my DNA is out there for each of these companies, and I get some crazy relationships, but they all sort of make sense at one level or another. But I will say that other people get very upset when they say, I'm 50% Irish. My father was 100% Irish. My mother's German, but my father's 100% Irish. So Ancestry said I'm only 18% Irish. They're wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. Well, guess what? They're digging very deep into your genetics. Who lived in Ireland 500 years ago? Who lived in Ireland 1,000 years ago? The Vikings left more than their oars on the shores of Ireland in 1,000 years ago. So there is Northwestern DNA floating around in Ireland and in the United Kingdom and Scotland. So you're going to find these results that aren't necessarily overwhelmed by other places, but of other heritages, I guess you'd say. But it will still tell you that you have Irish in your DNA. But don't discount it because your father and his parents, etc., were all born and raised in Ireland. But there certainly are many people from Scotland that were tossed out. They were tossing out the Irish and they were pushing the Scots over into Ulster County, for example. So a lot of the people with Scottish heritage, Scottish DNA, occupied Ireland for many, many years, hundreds of years. My ancestors included. So it's not an open and shut case. Some companies are going to get different results than others, and you have to take them all with a grain of salt. They're all accurate based on their databases, based on the people who test. For example, if no one of Irish heritage tested ever, which it would never happen. If no one who with Irish heritage had tested, you could never prove that you were Irish based on DNA because there's no database for the Irish. But that's not true. Lots and lots of people with Irish heritage have tested. So the same holds true with some companies. DNA testing was illegal. So let's talk about which company does what. Y-DNA is for men only, and it looks at the ATGC. And I didn't go too far into this, but the ATGC are the proteins that make up DNA: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Please don't write that down unless you really want to know. You just need to know ATGC. And when you see representations of DNA on television or whatever, or in magazines, those are the letters that you're going to see. You're going to see AT, AT, GC, CG, TA, AT, all the way down the line. Millions of these connections along a particular strand of DNA. And A always bonds with T, G always bonds with C. You'll never see you'll never see adenine bonding with cytosine, for example. So that's how these patterns can be pretty much predicted in any DNA, whether it's Y, mitochondrial, or the other autosomals. So Y-DNA is men only. So Ancestry and a couple of other these companies, they don't do Y-DNA. Family Search does. I think MyHeritage does. 23andMe is starting to do it. The mitochondrial DNA, which is for everyone, it looks at those ATGC patterns in mitochondria. And again, not all the companies do mitochondrial. Then finally, autosomal. This is the one that everybody wants because a great majority of people who are testing for DNA, they're looking for family. They're looking for cousins. They're cousin hunters, uh, to a sense. Some of them are adoptees. They're looking for their blood relationships. They're looking for their real father. They're the father that raised them loved them, and they love this guy, and but he's just not the biological father. And there's a story there somewhere, but not important. They just want to know who the bio father is, particularly if mom has passed away and nobody can tell her who the bio father is, or she never would admit who it was. So, or a biological grandparent or great grandparent, and it goes down the line like that. So some of this autosomal testing is very helpful. And in the case of CC Moore, it's proven to be an enormous boon to police departments all over the world, whereby through this research, they can narrow down very, very closely to the likely perpetrator of the crime. And I think that's tremendous. A lot of people say, well, I'm not going to do a DNA test because I don't want these companies selling my DNA results to anybody. First of all, if they did, they would do it anonymously, and you'd have to approve anybody that would have your information. But from my perspective, if somebody can find a murderer based on my DNA, have at it. Go for it. I don't care. That's fine with me. I'd be happy to be a part of resolving all of that. And then again, I mean, I usually just say that there are any questions all the way through this. Hopefully there's some. Are there questions, Lindsay?
Nothing in the chat right now.
Okay, that's fine. So I'm going to end this here. And I just want to thank everybody for coming in. That's me. That's Old Bones Genealogy of New England. I didn't structure that very well. But this is my website, www.oldbones.info. And when you go to that site, there's a banner across the top, and there's an information link. When you click that, you scroll down and it says documents, free documents, or whatever it says. You click on that and it opens up a Dropbox folder that has probably 60, 70, 80 different documents that you can look at it on your computer just without downloading it. You can download it into a electronic file on your computer, or you can print it. You can do whatever you want. It's all for free. This is my email address, and this is my blog, which I'm not terribly active with. I blog from time to time, maybe once or twice a month.